Lost in translation. I've been thinking about rereading some of the Russian classics again, perhaps beginning with Anna Karenina, but I'm always wary of translations. Since my Russian is limited pretty much to samovar and troika, I obviously have to read a translation if I'm going to read these Russian classics. So I was thinking this time I might read it in a French translation. I'll explain why in a minute. I already read an English translation many years ago, and generally, as I said, I don't really like reading translations, although it's clearly a necessity in some cases. But so much is lost, I'm sure, in translation. I've heard it said, for instance, that when Constance Garnett translated Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment in 1914, that she worked so quickly that she just skipped over words and phrases that were too difficult. Nevertheless, some people cling religiously to her translation. There's always a tension when translating between being too literal and trying to capture the feel, the mood, the ethos of the text. If a novel was written, in Russian say, during the reign of Queen Victoria, should it be translated into Victorian English or into something more modern? This is not just about the meaning of words and sentences, but about capturing the mood and feel of the original text. These things are pretty difficult to define. Translation is always more than just translation. It inevitably involves interpretation. Consider a very simple example. French, like many languages, has two forms of address, the formal and the informal. I would address strangers and older people as vous, but close friends, family and younger people as tu. There's even a verb in French, tutoyer, which means to address with tu, and its counterpart, vous voyez. If I were translating a book from English to French, I would have to decide whether the formal or informal mode of address should be used in each case. To a French reader, the use of tu between people would indicate a closer relationship than the use of vous. The translator is required to judge the closeness of these relationships. On the other hand, how does someone translating from French to English indicate the use of tu as opposed to vous? In a conversation between a man and a woman, a change of usage might indicate a change in their relationship. Using tu inappropriately might indicate disrespect, whereas using vous, when tu might be expected, could indicate a certain coldness in the relationship. In Les Miserables, Javert uses tu to address Jean Valjean to indicate his lower status, almost until the end of the book, when then he suddenly switches to vous, unwittingly showing his respect. English lacks such subtleties. You, formal, and thou, informal, just don't cut it these days. The translator would have to find some other way to indicate this change in the relationship. Perhaps Javert would begin to address Jean Valjean as Monsieur Valjean, or perhaps he would use the term sir. I can't honestly remember what the English translations do in this case, or whether they try to do it at all. This is just one very obvious example of the difficulties of translating literature from one language to another. In this respect, the French translation of Anna Karenina would follow the Russian more closely than does the English, since Russian also has a formal and informal mode of address. It's also the case, of course, that in the upper echelons of Russian society, many people spoke French rather than Russian. Some barely knew Russian at all. And I'm not sure whether this is true of Anna Karenina, but I know that in War and Peace there are long passages that are actually written in French, not Russian. If it's this difficult with prose, I can't even begin to imagine how you would translate a poem from one language to another when rhyme, rhythm, alliteration and so on can be so important, when words are not used necessarily in their literal sense. Imagine translating between languages which have very little in common historically, such as Chinese to English and vice versa, for example. Language reflects an entire culture, and even between similar languages, idiomatic expressions are very difficult to translate. Consider the French expression avoir du chien. Literally translated, this would be to have the dog. I'm informed that when referring to a woman, it means d'être séduisante, d'avoir un charme provoquant. The English translation of this should be pretty clear. To be seductive, to have a provocative charm. When translating from the French, it's impossible to use a literal translation for a phrase like avoir du chien. So really, the translator has to look for a corresponding idiomatic phrase in English. Well, how about this French phrase? Le petit Jésus en culotte de velours. This literally translates as the little Jesus in velvet underwear, but this apparently means to go down smoothly. It's difficult to think of a similarly colourful English expression to use in its place. On the other hand, how would you translate into French English expressions such as dead as a doornail or pay through the nose? I would love to be able to read French, German, Russian, Spanish, Chinese novels in their original language. In the meantime, I may have to content myself with a French translation of the Russian, in which at least tu and vous correspond to their equivalents in the original Russian.